Alrighty, everyone. We shall move swiftly onwards. More economics. What more could you want? So, we are talking about fiscal policy, and someone asked a question, and then the answer to that question is going to come now on the slide. I'm going to have to show you an example though. So, when we talk about fiscal stimulus, then obviously fiscal stimulus has a demand side effect, and there are two what we call fiscal policy multipliers. So first of all, there's the government spending multiplier, and then there's a tax multiplier. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, if you recall from our aggregate expenditure equation at equilibrium, where y equals c and c equals a plus b y minus taxes. So y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m. So we've got autonomous m there. There's no marginal propensity to consume. No tax rate. I'm just going to have a lump sum tax rate to make our lives easier. What do we end up with this equation when we rearrange it? We have y is equal to 1 over 1 minus b times a plus I plus g minus bt plus x minus m. Everyone comfortable with that? Old hat stuff, whatever, Nick. Yeah? Okay, cool. What is the spending multiplier for government spending? Okay? In other words, if we change government spending by some amount, we're going to change output by some amount. And that change in output, given some change in government spending, is going to be, and I think we went through quite a lot of detail about how we derive this, but the change in y for a change in g, we ignore all of these. I say, before I put lines through them, I'm going to ignore these other constants as I change g. This would be my government spending multiplier. Right? Everyone happy with that? There is a video on it. If you're not comfortable, remember, just go back and watch that video. And I think we've got notes on it too. What about taxes? By how much does output change if we change taxes? It's 1 over 1 minus b. That's part of the coefficient of taxes. But what else is the coefficient? Right? So the actual multiplier for taxes would be negative b over 1 minus b. You happy with that? The coefficient on g is just 1 over 1 minus b. The coefficient on t is 1 over 1 minus b times negative b. 1 over 1 minus b times negative b is negative b over 1 minus b. Okay? So this is the government spending multiplier, and this is the tax multiplier. When we change taxes by some amount, we change output by some amount, and the amount by which output changes is a multiple of what the tax changes. So if I increase taxes, what's going to happen to y? Well, wait, let's first take one step back. If I increase government spending, what is going to happen to y? Is it going to go up or go down? If I increase government spending, is my output going to go up or go down? Well, my multiplier is positive, so what is my change in y? Change in y is equal to 1 over 1 minus b times change in g. My government spending goes up, my output goes up. What about my tax multiplier? My change in y, is going to be equal to negative b over 1 minus b times change in t. If taxes go up, what happens to y? goes down, because look, it's negative. Increase in taxes times some negative number gives me a decrease in output. We know that. Increase in taxes, which way does aggregate demand shift? To the left. What happens to output? It goes down. It's negative. Right? Whew, I'm a little bit worried now because we had a problem with maths before, but I can't spend too much time on a partial differentiation, but I'll give you the general form of the story, and then you can go back home and read whatever maths texts you want to convince yourself that this is the case. But if I have a function, some general function, y is equal to x plus w, okay, then my partial derivatives would be dy by dx and dw by dx. What am I talking about? dy by dw. Okay, those are my two different derivatives. I can change x and that will have a change in y. And if I change w, it will have a change in y. If I change x and I change w, what will my change in y be? My change in y will be the partial derivative of x times change in x plus the partial derivative with respect to w times change in w. Okay? So that's the general maths. I'm not going to prove it to you or spend any more time. That's how it works. So if I have a change in G and a change in T, what will my change in Y be? My change in Y is equal to my derivative of Y with respect to G times the change in G plus the derivative of Y with respect to T times the change in T. Okay? So the derivative of Y with respect to G is just the government spending multiplier. So 1 over 1 minus B times change in G plus the derivative of Y with respect to T is the tax multiplier, tax revenue multiplier. So plus negative B over 1 minus T times change in T. So change in Y will be that equation if I'm changing government spending and I'm changing taxes. Okay. So there was a question in your tutorial where someone showed me an option where it said something about there's a change in taxes and a change in government spending to leave the budget balance unchanged. Okay? If we leave the budget balance unchanged, that means we're changing government spending by the same amount as changing taxes. Changing both by the same amount, then the budget balance is not going to change. Okay? The discretionary budget balance at any rate. Okay? Whew. So, we're going to change government spending and we're going to change taxes, but we're going to change them by the same amount. You with me? So let's say I'm going to change G by 100 and I'm going to change T by 100. I could make this more abstract and say I'm going to change G by some amount A and change T by some amount A, but I'm going to stick with 100 just to start as a starting place. Okay? So it's 100 and 100. What will my change in Y be? Well, my change in Y will be equal to 1 over 1 minus B times 100 plus negative, so minus B over 1 minus, that's not supposed to be a B, I mean the letter T. I'm glad everyone's awake. Okay? Now I can simplify this equation and make it look very, very obvious what the answer is here. 1 over 1 minus b times 100 plus minus b over 1 minus b. Well, I've got the number 100 as a common factor. So I have 1 over 1 minus b minus b over 1 minus b times 100. Okay, I've got a common denominator. 1 minus b over 1 minus b times 100. 1 minus b over 1 minus b is, which is just 1 times 100, which is then change in y, 100. So if I change government spending by some amount A and I change my taxes by the same amount A, my change in y will be equal to A. Okay? Dun dun dun. Yeah. Okay? So what we're saying then with these expenditure multipliers in this particular example is, if the increase in government spending is matched by an increase in taxes, there will still be a positive impact on output. Demand will still shift to the right. If I increase government spending, I shift demand to the right. If I increase taxes, I shift demand to the left. But if I increase them both by the same amount, my aggregate demand curve will still be a net movement to the right. Move to the right more than it will shift backwards to the left. How do we know that? Well, because the movement to the right will be a 1, and the movement to the left will be a minus b, and b is less than 1. So the movement to the right will be greater than the movement to the left. So there will be overall a movement to the right. Just so happens that if we have a movement to the right by some amount and an equal movement to the left, shift to the right by some amount with an equal shift to the left, if there is an increase in spending by the same amount as the increase in taxes, the shift to the right due to the increase in government spending will be greater than the shift to the left due to the increase in taxes. So the overall shift is a shift to the right, but that shift to the right is of the same magnitude as the increase in government spending. So there's basically no multiplier. Ordinarily, it would be a shift to an increase in government spending shifts aggregate demand to the right, and there's a multiplier effect, right? Here, the multiplier effect is essentially cancelled out. It's just a shift to the right of exactly the same amount, right? The multiplier ultimately is just 1, right? I know some people are following. I suspect some people are not. It will be in the video. Okay. This is just called a balanced budget multiplier. So you're changing taxes and government spending by the same amount. Your multiplier is just 1. Okay. So that is the answer to that touch option number 2. I don't even remember. Was it? Sorry? Touch 6 question 2. Option 2. Okay. That's how you deal with that. And here we have some fiscal stimulus. That diagram is explaining what I just explained in those maths equations. Okay? What about fiscal stimulus and aggregate supply? Well, we already know that a fiscal stimulus package that is heavy on tax cuts and light on government spending will work to stimulate aggregate supply, but an increase in government spending alone is not an effective way to stimulate production and create jobs. Okay, we've kind of discussed all of that ad nauseum. What about the magnitude of the stimulus? There's not enough empirical evidence to really know how effective governments are in, adjusting economies. It's a very difficult thing to measure. So we can give you all the theory. We can talk about, in theory, is it a good idea? In theory, is it a bad idea? In practice, we can't. It's difficult to test whether the theory is right. Okay? And there's also another problem when it comes to trying to measure these things. Any kind of discretionary fiscal stimulus is going to have, it doesn't happen immediately. The advantage of automatic fiscal policy is that it happens immediately. As soon as there's a change in the economy, the fiscal impact is immediate. But if it's discretionary, it has to go through a whole lot of processes. First of all, for example, the government has to say, right, we are actually in a recession and we want to increase spending. Number one, we have to first recognize that we're in a recession. Number two, we then have to put together policy that says we're in a recession, we want to increase spending. Then we have to take it to Parliament, and the lawmakers in Parliament, the parliamentarians, have to say, yes, we agree. Let's do that. Let's increase spending. After that has been decided, then government starts increasing spending. There's still going to be quite a long time before that actually has an impact on the economy. So there's a recognition lag, there's a lawmaking lag, and finally there's an impact lag. So it takes a long time for a change in government fiscal policy to actually result in a change in the economy. That's a bit of an issue. There are these time lags. And what we'll see in chapter 31 is that monetary policy doesn't suffer from these same time lags. It still has some lags, but they're different lags, which sometimes makes monetary policy much more effective than fiscal policy. And that brings us to the end of chapter 30. Excuse me? So we've got chapter 31 and chapter 26 still. 2 more chapters. Okay, stay with me. Let's do this. Let's take 1 minute. Stand up, jump around, whatever. Talk to people right next to you. Just get yourself mentally prepared. Do some yoga, whatever, meditation. We're starting chapter 31. Let's get ready. Okay. Chapter 31, what are we doing? What are the objectives? We are going to describe the objectives of South Africa's monetary policy and the framework that we have for setting and achieving those objectives. We're going to explain the monetary policy instruments that the Reserve Bank uses and how they work together to influence the interest rates in the economy. We've seen this before, we're going to sing it again. Remember, that's the theme of this whole course. We've seen it before, but we're seeing it again. Right? We're going to explain the transmission channels through which the Reserve Bank influences GDP. So we haven't come across this term before, transmission channels, but you'll see we've spoken about them. We just haven't called them transmission channels. We're going to illustrate and discuss the effect of a monetary policy action on interest rates, real GDP, and prices. And, of course, just graphically, we're going to talk about why the Reserve Bank gets involved in the economy at all. So what are our primary objectives? Sorry, and if you're following through the normal slides, then again, I've done my normal rearranging if I didn't like the way that they were arranged. Okay, so same slides, just don't necessarily look quite the same. So the monetary objective of South Africa's monetary policy, what is the key objective of the Reserve Bank? Stable prices. That is the objective, right? Who gives the objective to the Reserve Bank? Parliament, right? Not the public protector. Parliament, yeah? So, stable prices. Our central bank is called the SARB, which is called SARB actually. I don't think they call it the SARB, they just call it SARB. So SARB is South African Reserve Bank. That's the Central Bank of South Africa. And it's obviously the key monetary authority. I'm not sure if we have any other monetary authorities. Other countries have other have other financial authorities. I'm not sure if they have other, no. There's only one monetary authority, that's right. The Reserve Bank is the only monetary authority, and I think the Reserve Bank is also our financial authority. I could be wrong. The SARB is not is not owned by the government. It's privately owned. As we've discussed before, that's really of very little consequence. It's primarily a symbolic thing to say that the Reserve Bank makes decisions independent of the executive. Okay? Not without the input from the executive, but independent of the executive. And the main goal of monetary policy in South Africa is to control inflation. It controls inflation to achieve price stability. If you control inflation, then you are achieving price stability. What is price stability? How does it do this? The South African Reserve Bank uses the CPI. So remember, it measures something called the CPI. The CPI is an index of the price level, right? It's an index of all the prices of different goods and services that are bought by consumers. Consumer price index. So it measures the prices of a basket of goods. Then depending on what those prices are, that determines the value of the index. So by using the CPI, it can determine whether prices are going up or going down. It can determine what the inflation rate is by changes in the CPI. So price stability is measured and monitored through the CPI. To reduce inflation successfully, the Reserve Bank pays close attention to the CPI. And in fact, the CPI used to be called the CPIX. That was what the Reserve Bank looked at until 2008, and then it changed from CPIX to CPI. CPIX means CPI excluding mortgage interest rates, but for statistical and other reasons, they stopped looking at that measure of inflation and just measured CPI. So monetary policy is the responsibility of the Reserve Bank. So the role of the Reserve Bank is conducting monetary policy. What is the role of Parliament? There is a close collaboration between monetary and fiscal policy in South Africa, and an inflation targeting framework is used for conducting monetary policy, which is decided by the government in consultation with the Reserve Bank. So the framework, inflation targeting as a framework, is decided by government and the Reserve Bank, but the target and the mandate, which is price stability, is determined by Parliament. What is the role of the President? Well, it's limited to appointing the governor and 3 deputy governors. Thank goodness. Okay. Since 2000, South Africa has used an inflation targeting strategy, and the central bank makes a commitment to do what? To achieve an explicit inflation target, as well as to explain how its policy actions will achieve that target. Remember we said yesterday, we discussed that it's important for the Reserve Bank to communicate. Why does it want to communicate? Because it wants to try and influence expectations. It's important for people's expectations to match reality, to avoid things like an inflationary spiral, okay? And to avoid redistribution of incomes or redistribution of wealth when expectations don't match actual inflation, okay? Actual reality. So the Reserve Bank helps to try and guide those expectations by clearly communicating what it sees happening and what it's going to do to make sure that it achieves a target. So if it's got this specific target, it communicates to say, right, this is our target. We think we might be going to the top range of that target. If we see the data continuing to suggest that, we're going to start increasing interest rates. Then that puts into people's minds the idea that when they set their expectations about inflation, they should be towards the top end of the range of the target, which is 6%, right? The Reserve Bank is thinking it's going to be 6%, and they're going to be making adjustments if they think it's not going to be 6%, which means we should then anticipate that it's going to be 6%, because even if it starts looking like it's going to be more, the Reserve Bank is going to take action to bring it down. So we're then going to set our expectation of 6%. It's a really important aspect of monetary policy, which I do not think the Reserve Bank does particularly well. Having said that, I mean, it definitely explains what it's doing. I just don't think people really understand what it's doing, right? So I think there could be there's a big gap between the really thorough explanation that it gives and the understanding of that explanation on ground level. And I think there could be a bigger, I don't know, more effort put into changing that gap or shrinking that gap. How is inflation targeting conducted? Well, inflation targets are specified in terms of a range for the CPI inflation rate. So there's going to be a change in CPI, the rate of change, which measures inflation, and we want that rate of change to be within a specific target. And this is wrong. The aim to achieve an average inflation rate of 2% per year, that's nonsense. It's between 3 and 6%. 2%, that's, I think that's the UK target. The Bank of England, the BOE, which is the British Central Bank, their target is 2%. Ours is their range, 3 to 6%. What does inflation targeting achieve? It clearly states what the goal of monetary policy is. That's what inflation targeting does. We say this is what it is, so our goal is clearly stated, which therefore allows us to establish a framework of accountability. We can therefore hold the Reserve Bank accountable. Hang on a minute, are you achieving that range or not? If not, you are not achieving your mandate, right? Clearly accountable. And what it also does is it enables, by targeting some level, it enables us to keep inflation stable at that level. Okay, it's important because remember that stability is important for maintaining stability of employment. Yeah. So then if that is what our inflation targeting can achieve, what are the goals of inflation targeting? Sorry, that was the point I was going to make. The primary, when you look at the mandate of the Reserve Bank, the primary mandate is price stability. But the Reserve Bank, in fact, has a secondary mandate. Do you know what that secondary mandate is? That's right. Okay? If prices are stable and inflation outlook is good, well, then do what you can to stimulate growth as well. Okay? But not at the expense of price stability. Cool. So what are the goals then of inflation targeting? We want to make monetary policy clear in order to improve planning and decision making in both private and public sector. It's part of a coordinated approach to reduce inflation in order to promote high and sustainable growth as well as create employment. It's also something that's used to focus monetary policy and to improve the accountability of the Reserve Bank, and it's used to guide inflation expectations and thus price and wage setting behavior. What then are the instruments? Oh, did I go the wrong way? Sorry. What are the instruments? We know, first of all, there's a repo rate. What else? Open reserve, not open market. The reserve requirements and open market operations. Okay? Let's briefly discuss them and then we can go. technically we've got 10 minutes, we'll just finish 5 minutes early, okay? We've spoken about this before, but it's a good place to stop. What is the repo rate? Remember, the repo rate is the rate at which banks can borrow from the Reserve Bank, okay? It's a repurchase rate. It's the refinancing system refers to the way in which the central bank extends credit to banks when they are short of cash reserves, okay? It's called refinancing, and it's called a repurchase, if you recall from the previous discussion, because what the commercial banks do, technically, is they sell some of their loan portfolio to the Reserve Bank with the agreement that they will buy it back, okay, at a later stage. It's usually that they will buy it back the next day, or they will buy it back in the next week, or they will buy it back in the next couple of hours. So it's a very short-term financing. Okay? They sell it to the Reserve Bank, which boosts their reserves, and then once they've got enough cash into their accounts so that their reserves have gone up, then they take that cash and they buy back the portfolio. Done. And they meet their reserve requirements throughout that period. Okay? Repurchase agreement. Repurchase rate. Repo. Okay? That's what it stands for. The cost, so it's the cost at which banks obtain liquidity. So obtain liquidity means basically get cash from the Reserve Bank. Oh, I don't know why there's a space there. And it's referred to as the repurchase rate. In order to achieve a liquidity shortage, so if the Reserve Bank wants to basically get banks to increase their reserves, so impose a situation where there's a liquidity shortage, right? So banks are not holding enough reserves, right? The Reserve Bank can use changes in the Reserve Bank requirements or go into markets and use open market operations. Usually what the Reserve Bank will do is both of those at the same time. So what tends to happen is there's a cash reserve requirement, which then creates a liquidity requirement, and the Reserve Bank can then manipulate that liquidity requirement or help banks to achieve that liquidity requirement through the repo rate, and the bank can adjust that rate, and in so doing affects the kind of liquidity access that commercial banks have. So the cash reserve requirement, we know what this is. It compels banks to keep a certain percentage of their deposits on reserve in an account at the central bank. And if a bank experiences an increase in its deposits, it is required to keep more reserves. And that's where it can have a problem, where it doesn't have enough cash reserves. And it might need to borrow directly from the Reserve Bank. But commercial banks also borrow directly from other banks. A bank that has excess reserves can lend to a bank that doesn't have enough reserves. And that happens in an overnight market, and we have the I think it's called the SABOR, the South African Bank Overnight Rate or something like that. So where banks lend excess reserves to other banks overnight. So I think that's the SABOR. I think. Anyway, we also have open market operations where the Reserve Bank purchases or sells government securities, and in so doing it affects the interest rate. And then the textbook gives this whole discussion about the market for reserves. And yeah, we'll continue that discussion after the test.